Welcome to Empowered with Elizabeth Naumovski. What do you think of when you hear the name Valerie Gibson? I think of pioneer activist, celebrity speaker on joyful aging, relationships, and sexuality, an incredible writer, author, and media personality. But did you know that Valerie Gibson is also the one who started the cougar movement and coined the phrase cougar? You know, older women dating younger men. Settle in, ladies. We have a pretty exciting conversation coming up with my interesting friend, Valerie Gibson. Val, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Not at all, my pleasure.
So a lot of people don't know this about you, that you are quite the activist. When did you first become aware of your drive for social awareness and activism?
It's a hard question, actually, Liz, because I think all of my life, even as a child, I had this instinct to know that something was not right for women somehow. I lived through an era, remember, where women were second-class citizens. We were not allowed to do this, that, not allowed to be doctors, surgeon. We couldn't be anything except probably nurse, secretary, or wife. And that was about it. And we were really held down very strongly. So, and I never quite adjusted that, even as a young person. I never quite understood that. But as a child, I really was entirely different because I lived was born at the beginning of the war, and also lived in Germany immediately the war ended. My father was famous during that time, and we were over there because of his fame and abilities during the war. And a childhood that was amassed with pain and hurt by people damaged, buildings damaged. The world was damaged. And I think the interesting part of that was I became aware that the world around me, particularly when I was in England, was all women. And I think the fact, of course, was obvious. The men were all at war, everybody. There was no men at home, hardly. So who had to do everything and take up everything? Do the factory work, build tanks, and I think what happened was women suddenly discovered, because they'd been held back so long, so hard for so long, that, hey, they could do these things, not only do them, but do them as well as men. And I think that was a big moment in women's history, if you like, women's empowerment, particularly. That they could do this. They could actually run a country, even not allowed to be politicians or anything like that. But they could do everything the men were doing and had to. It wasn't a question they were told they couldn't. They had to. The men were not.
So you lived and survived as a small child in England during World War II and after in Germany, which must have been quite traumatic. But you also say that the war altered women's lives, perhaps for the first time and forever, as regards to their place in life and their empowerment. Now, you said your father was really famous. What was the change and why?
You mean for the women or for myself?
For yourself and the women.
Well, remember, I was terribly young, and I was a small child. But I had a childhood that you wouldn't have liked or anybody. I mean, I just feel really strongly for the children in Ukraine, for instance. War is horrific. Or you live in things, bad things, hearing things you shouldn't hear as a child or see, really. It was a very, very harsh time. But of course, we were in Germany and the place was demolished. And that was really hard to see. And I listened to stories from the people who worked for us that you wouldn't believe. Like, only people who've been through war could believe that such cruelty and terror existed. And of course, it does. And I learned I didn't live in a world that was full of brightness and happiness and toys and good food or anything. It wasn't like that at all. War, there was no food, hardly, for anybody in England. They're just, women managed. And I think my admiration for women was absolutely born during those times, no matter how small I was. It was born that women were amazing.
Well,
And
and that was amazing too, because that was through your informative years as well. So when we come back, we've got to go to commercial break, but when we come back, we'll continue on with your story, Val. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Empowered with Elizabeth Naumovski, where we're discussing activism, trailblazing, and social awareness with author and media personality Valerie Gibson. Val, we were just talking about you living in Germany. How old were you when you started working in a newspaper when you returned to the UK?
well, there's a big gap there because I was 16 when I started working. And the reason I started working was simple. My father, who I hadn't, by the way, met, I didn't meet him till I was 7 years old. This is all war stuff. Had stated categorically when I was about 12 that I would not be going to university, neither would either my sisters, because university was wasted on women, and he wasn't going to stand for that. And that was, of course, remember the era, fathers dominating everything, men dominating everything. And so I could not continue further on with education. But boy, in a way, education was massive going out to work at 16. And I learned more that way than I ever would in a university.
So,
But
how is the social climate then for women in what was known as a man's profession, as you were just saying? For instance, what was the workplace reaction then when a woman became pregnant, as you did? How was that accepted?
well, it wasn't. You were fired if you got pregnant in those days.
Oh,
It,
wow.
it it was simple, you're just out 3 months. You announced it or didn't announce it or what, thrown out because they didn't want pregnant women around. And it was an era, and a lot of people don't understand or believe this, but people did not want to see a pregnant woman. You were supposed to go home and stay there. That was the whole
And
point.
hide.
Yes, and I had wanted to work in a newspaper, and I'd gone to the editor and asked for a job, and he said, "No, we don't hire women." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Oh, we did once, many years ago, and they just distracted all the men, so we never hired another woman."
Huh.
And I said, "Yes, what can I do? I want to work here." And I was a pretty determined little person and said, I want to work here. What can I do? Oh, well, you can, well, you can do this and run around with copies and, you know, that sort of thing. And so I did whatever I was asked to do in order to get in. And the men, of course, in those days, again, you've got to understand, I was 16 and pretty attractive at that time and was sexually harassed day and night. I married everybody. It was just the way working was for young women. It
Right.
was the way. And we did learn something very much that you don't perhaps learn today is we learned to get along and work with men by still saying no. And they did respect a woman who stood her ground and said, I'm not interested. Get away from me. Teach me how to do this. And then they seemed to come around. So it worked out. It wasn't easy. They sent me off to the most ghastly of jobs that they didn't want to do. In those days, they were covering things like baby shows, dog shows, funerals, and I had to go to a funeral in the pouring rain. You were supposed to get every name off every wreath. And of course, the rain was running all the names, things like that. It was desperate. And of course, they didn't want to do any of this work, but I did it for them. And that was the way I stayed. And
So,
of course,
so Val, you
I
stayed. You did all these jobs that nobody else wanted to do. But how long did it take you to actually, do a job where you're a writer or some other position where you weren't just running around?
I didn't because women didn't get along higher than the lowest of the low in those days in the newspaper. There were no other women anyway. So, and a most factor was I got pregnant. I was married happily and got pregnant. And of course, I was supposed to be fired after 3 months. Now, there was one little detail. I ran what was known then in the city as the press ball. It was the press ball for all the dignitaries and all. It was huge. And I was running this, and nobody else knew how to do this. So they kept me on.
Well,
And was actually pregnant, got more and more pregnant because it was a little ways off. And I went to the ball 8 months pregnant to the horror of everybody. They did
hold
not
that
want.
thought. Hold that thought. The horror of everyone. We'll be right back with more of Val. Welcome back to Empowered with Elizabeth Naumovski, where we're discussing activism, trailblazing, and social awareness with author and media personality Valerie Gibson. Val, before we went to break, you were talking about going to the ball pregnant, and people were horrified at the fact that you were there.
Indeed, they were. I was 8 months pregnant, and I was also with a man who wasn't my husband. He was away at sea. He was a merchant seaman, and one of the guys in the reporter's room offered to escort me. And he wore a kilt, and I danced, pregnant, and they sat there stunned. They were really stunned. It was very unusual for a woman to be out and about at 8 months, and also to be at a ball dancing with someone else's husband, I suppose.
That sounds so much like you, my friend. Like, that doesn't even surprise me at all. But I want to fast forward now, because one of the things that people don't know about you is that you started fighting for the rights of the challenged and disabled when it wasn't even a fledgling activity. And challenged children and people were discounted and ostracized by society back then. So what prompted you to do this?
I had a baby, and she was challenged and disabled. And in those days, people threw them into institutions. And my father, unfortunately, not an overly nice man, said, you throw her in an institution, throw away the key, and hope she dies. And I
Oof.
said, that will never, ever happen to my little girl. Never. She will have whatever I can find in life for her, the best. And I was a teenager, and even then I had in my head, not a word, it didn't exist, about integration. That's a word that just wasn't there in that era. But because she was born different with difficulties, she had many. Why couldn't she live a good life like everybody else, but with supervision, with being overlooked constantly and so on? And that was all part of the activism in me. I said, just a minute, what's going on here? People did not want challenged people, children or adults. They didn't want them in those days. It was a cruel world for anyone in that situation. There was no support services. There was no social services. There were no schools. There was nothing. I was told, go home, lady. It's your problem. And that was the end of the assistance that I got at the initial stages. And that really fired up my activism. It really did. This was all wrong.
So I know that you lived in the Channel Islands with your daughter in the late 1960s for a time working. You were working at a 100-year-old newspaper there, and they were very set in their old ways. So now you did your, activism for your daughter, but then you did some activism at this old newspaper. Especially when you brought them out on strike for better wages and conditions, especially for women, and introduced the UK Journalists Union. How'd that work out?
Well, I did do that actually, because I was appalled that the wages they were paying, which were very poor, and they were grown men with families, just poverty, living in poverty. It was all wrong. And I was, I had this strong streak of justice for working people, not just women, but also, men. You see, you've got to know that when I joined the newspaper, the owner of the newspaper hired me and said, well, if you're not allowed to wear trousers, and if you even
But wait, you're not allowed to wear trousers. And what did you do?
Next day I came to work in hot pants.
Of course you
I
did.
don't know how many people know what they are, but they're a kind of a shorts, romper type of suit thing. And of course, there's nothing they could do. They weren't trousers. So,
Potato,
and
potato, whatever, something close enough.
a big Christmas party where we met the master, it was all very much that kind of feudal thing there. I wore trousers to that, and there's nothing they could do. So, as for the union, we were told, think union and you're fired. Well, that set the spark off for me because you see, with the poverty I saw the men with their families, um, the mantra of the island was, if you don't like it, get off the island. It was very simple.
So let's
Uh,
end on that right now. The mantra, if you don't like it, get off the island. I mean, you were dealing with a lot right now. So we're going to come back and talk to you about other things that you dealt with. So please don't go away. We'll be right back with Valerie Gibson. Welcome back to Empowered with Elizabeth Naumovski, where we're discussing activism, trailblazing, and social awareness with author and media personality Valerie Gibson. Now, Val, before we went to the break, we were talking about you mentioning union at the newspaper in the Channel Islands. So quickly, what happened?
I brought them out on strike with another young man. Everybody fled that was in the group that we were trying to form the union, thinking we would lose our jobs. But in fact, the owner lost his job. The young people on the board chucked him out, and I kept mine. So that was good. They got good wages. We joined the National Union of Journalists, so we were all on a scale and everything, and they're still enjoying that there all these years later.
Perfect. So I want to quickly talk about a book that you wrote in 1996 for older women dating younger men. Why did you write it, and what happened with you with that book? What was the societal reaction?
Well, and society's reaction was not good. In fact, I took it to America to do the talk show circuit, and I found that the Americans were horrified. They thought it was terrible. I was told it was disgusting, not normal, because all it was a cheeky book like the one I wrote much later about older women dating younger men, single people. No, this was disgusting. In fact, at the point it got really bad, it was liked in LA. They loved it. But got really bad. I felt I had to go back to Canada because the reaction was bad. It was not good. That was why there's such a big gap between that and the Cougar book.
Okay,
You
so
see,
wait. You just said the Cougar book, and I know that everyone's going to want to ask you about that. Then came Cougar, the book that you
yes,
launched in 2001, which is a
yes.
moniker for older women who date younger men worldwide. Now, was that well received, and how did you come up with that?
Yes, well, I wanted a name for a title, really, for women to feel they are sort of members of an elite club. It was all meant for, as a happy thing to give, empower women 40 plus, that they were wonderful, they were valuable, they were clever, they were sophisticated, they could do what they want. I mean, they were running businesses and all sorts of things. Women were already very empowered at that time, but there was still a lot of reaction about older women dating younger men. It was still not liked very much or seen very much because the women, hid it. And I think that was the first one was written because I was dating younger men and thought, wow, this is good. And we should enjoy it. Everybody should enjoy this in the 40s if you're single. Why not? Men have done it for centuries. Why can't women? And anyway, the cougar thing was the animal is a beautiful animal. And I thought, wow, it's really in control of its environment. It's powerful, strong, good looking, everything. I feel women of plus 40 plus are. And I thought that's a great title for them. And it was all started with a cheeky, funny book, Hoover, and it was a bestseller eventually. But at first, there was some reaction. This isn't nice. Men can do what they like, but women can't and shouldn't. And I never, never accepted that. So anyway, the Cougar thing took off, rather to my surprise. It was written to help women's self-esteem. And it took off all over the world. I was doing interviews in Japan, Australia, Portugal, Peru. Like the whole world was waiting, I think, women at that age to have something to grasp and say, yeah, you know what, I'm pretty special. And so that was what happened. But I think what the sad part, there is a sad part, it got picked up. America feels they started it now, by the way, which they didn't. And it got picked up by people who made it sleazy. Sorry about the cat
No,
behind
no,
me.
I love the cat, and I'm so sorry. Quickly, in 5 seconds, the bad part about it, because we have to go.
Into something sleazy. It is not. It is women who are in control of their lives, their sexual lives, everything about their lives. It's a good and wonderful thing to be a cougar.
Thank you so much, Val. It was great to see you today.
You too, Liz.
As you can see, Valerie is extremely passionate, whether she's advocating for people with disabilities or women dating later in life. So, what did we learn today? Regardless of your age and regardless of what you do in life, do it with passion. Do it with a love of life, a zest for helping others, and enjoy every moment. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski, and I'm trying to empower you and make frugality fashionable. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.